The Great King, Day 3. Music was flowing out of the farmhouse in a golden stream, as if the sun were inside the window shining out. Will paused astonished and stood listening. Somebody was playing a harp, long rippling arpeggios soaring out like birdsong. Then, without a break, the music changed to something like a Bach sonata, notes and patterns as precise as snowflakes. John Rowlands looked down at him with a smile for a moment, then pushed open the door and went in. A side door was opened into a little parlor that Will had never noticed before. It looked like a creaky, neat best room, tucked away from the big kitchen living room where all the real life of the house went on. The music was coming from this parlor. Roland stuck his head round the corner, and so did Will. Sitting there, running his hands over the strings of a harp twice his own height, was Bran. He stopped, stilling the strings with his palms. "Hello, then." "Much better," said John Rowlands. "Very much better that today." "Good," Bran said. Will said, "I didn't know you could play the harp." "Ah," Bran said solemnly, "lots of things the English don't know. Mr. Rowland teaches me. He taught your auntie, too. This is hers I'm at." He ran one finger across the lilting strings. "Freezing in the winter is this room, always, but it keeps better in tune than in the warm. Ah, Will Stanton, you don't know what a distinguished place you are in. This is the only farm in Wales where there are two harps. Mr. Rowlands has one in his house, too, you see." He nodded through the window at the trio of farm cottages across the yard. "I practice there mostly, but Mrs. Rowlands is busy cleaning today." "Where's David Evans?" said John Rowlands. "In the yard with Riz. Couched, I think." "Dolch." He went out, preoccupied. "I thought you'd be at school," Will said. "Half holiday. I forget why." Bran wore the protective smoky glasses even indoors. They made him look eccentric and unreal, the inscrutable dark circles taking all expression out of his pale face. He was wearing dark trousers, too, and a dark sweater, making his white hair still more striking and unnatural. Will thought suddenly he must do it on purpose. He likes being different. "An awful thing happened today," he said, and told Bran about the sheep. But again he left out the quick glimpse of the attacker that had made him think it was a white dog. "Are you sure the sheep was alive when John left it?" Bran said. "Oh, yes, I think so. There's always the chance someone just stopped and took it away. I expect John's checking." "What a weird business," Bran said. He stood up, stretching. "I've had enough practicing. Want to come out?" "I'll go and tell Aunt Jen." On the way out, Bran picked up his flat leather school bag from a chair beside the door. "I must drop this off at home and put the kettle on for Da. He comes in for a cup around about now if he's working nearby." Will said curiously, "Does your mother work too?" "Oh, she's dead. Died when I was a baby. I don't remember her at all." Bran gave him a strange sideways look. "Nobody told you about me then?" "My dad and I were a bachelor household. Mrs. Evans is very nice always. We eat supper at the farm weekends." "Of course, you haven't been here at the weekend yet." "I feel as if I've been here for weeks," Will said, putting his face up to the sun. Something in the way Bran spoke was making him oddly uneasy, and he did not want to think about it too closely. He pushed it to the back of his mind to join that image of the flicker of a white muzzle through the bracken. "Where's Kafal?" he said. "Oh, he'll be out with Da. Thinking I am still at school," Bran laughed. "The time we had when Kafal was young, trying to persuade him that school is for boys, not puppies. When I went to primary school in the village, he used to sit at the gate all day, just waiting." "Where do you go now?" "To Wynn Grammar, in a bus." They scuffed their feet through the dust of the path down to the cottages, a path made by Will's two ruts with hummocky grass growing between. There were 3 cottages, but only 2 were occupied. Now that he was closer, Will could see that the third had been converted into a garage. He looked beyond, up the valley where the mountains rose blue-hazed and beautiful into the clear sky, and he shivered. Though the mystery of the wounded sheep had taken up the front of his mind for a while, the deeper uneasiness was swelling back again now. All around, throughout the countryside, he could feel the malevolence of the dark growing, pushing at him. It could not focus upon him, follow him like the gaze of a great fierce eye. An old one had the power to conceal himself so that his presence could not at once be sensed so precisely. But clearly the Grey King knew that he was bound to come, soon, from somewhere. They had their prophecies, as did the light. The barriers had gone up, and were growing stronger every day. Will felt suddenly how strange it was for him to be the invader, for the light to be advancing against the dark. Always before, through all the centuries, it had been the other way around, with the powers of the dark sweeping in fearsome, recurrent attack over the land of men protected in gentleness by the light. Always the light had been the defenders of men, champions of all that the dark came to overturn. Now an old one must deliberately reverse the long habit of mind. Now he must find the thrust of attack, instead of the resolute, sturdy defense which for so long had kept the dark at bay. But of course, he thought, this attack itself is a small part of a defense, to build resistance for that other last and most dreadful time when the dark will come rising again. It is a quest to awaken the last allies of the light, and there is very little time. Bran said suddenly, uncannily echoing the last thread of his thought, "Halloween tonight." Yes, Will said. Before he could say more, they were at the door of the cottage. It was half open, low, heavy door, and set in the stone wall. At Bran's footstep, the dog Kafal came bounding out, a small white whirlwind, leaping and whining with pleasure, licking his hand. It was noticeable that he did not bark. From inside, a man's voice called Bran, and he began to speak in Welsh. Then, as Will followed Bran through the door, the man speaking, standing shirt-sleeved at a table, turned in mid-sentence and caught sight of him. He broke off at once and said formally, "I beg your pardon." "This is Will," Bran said, tossing his bag of books on the table. "Mr. Evans' nephew." "Yes, I thought perhaps it was. How do you do, young man?" Bran's father came forward, holding out his hand. His gaze was direct and his handshake firm, though Will had an immediate curious feeling that the real man was not there behind the eyes. "I am Owen Davies. I have been hearing about you." "How do you do, Mr. Davies?" said Will. He was trying not to look surprised. Whatever he had expected in Bran's father, it was not this, a man so completely ordinary and unremarkable, who could pass on the street without noticing he had been there. Someone as odd as Bran should have an odd father. But Owen Davies was all medium in average height, medium brown hair in medium quantity, a pleasant, ordinary face with a slightly pointed nose and thin lips, an average voice, neither deep nor high, with the same precise enunciation that Will was beginning to learn belonged to all North Welshmen. His clothes were ordinary, the same shirt and trousers and boots that would be worn by anyone else on a farm. Even the dog that stood at his side quietly watching them all was a standard Welsh sheepdog, black-backed, white-chested, black-tailed, unremarkable. Not like Kafal, just as Bran's father was not at all like Bran. "There is tea in the pot, Bran, if you would both like a cup," Mr. Davies said. "I have had mine. I am off over to the big pasture, and I shall be going out tonight. There is a chapel meeting. Mrs. Evans will give you your supper." "That's good," Will said cheerfully. "He can help me with my homework." "Homework?" said Bran. "Oh, yes. This isn't just a holiday for me, you know. They gave me all kinds of work from school, so I shouldn't get behind. Algebra today, and history." "That will be very good," Mr. Davies said earnestly, pulling on his waistcoat, "so long as Bran takes care to do his own work as well. Of course I know he will do that. Well, it is nice to meet you, Will. See you later, Bran. Kafal can stay." And he went out nodding to them amiably, but with complete seriousness, leaving Will to reflect that after all there was one thing about Owen Davies that was not altogether common. He had not a glimmer of laughter in him. There was no expression in Bran's face. He said flatly, "My father is a big one for a chapel. He is a deacon, and there are 2 or 3 meetings for him in the week, and we go twice on Sundays." "Oh," Will said. "Yes, I was right. Want a cup of tea?" "No, not really, thank you." "Let's go out then." With absent-minded conscientiousness, Bran rinsed out the teapot and left it neatly inverted on the draining board. "Tur diema, Kafal." The white dog bounded happily beside them as they crossed the fields away from the cottage and farm, up the valley towards the mountains and the lone near peak. It stood at a right angle to the mountain behind it, jutting into the flat valley floor. "Funny how that rock sticks out like that," Will said. "Craigir Ardien, that's special. It's the only place in Britain where cormorants nest inland. Not very far inland, of course. 4 miles from the sea, we are here. Haven't you been over there? Come on, we've got time." Bran changed direction slightly. "You can see the birds fine from the road." "I thought the road was that way," Will said, pointing. "It is. We can cut across to it this way." Bran opened a gate onto a footpath, crossed the path, and scrambled over the wall on the other side. "The only thing is, you must go quietly," he said with a grin. "This is Caredog Pritchard's land." "Hush, Kafal," Will said in a heavy stage whisper, turning his head, but the dog was not there. Will paused, puzzled. "Bran? Where's Kafal?" Bran whistled. They both stood waiting, looking at the long sweep of the slate-edged stone wall along the stubbled field. Nothing moved. The sun shone. Far away, sheep called. Bran whistled again, with no result. Then he went back, with Will close behind, and they climbed over the wall again and went down to the footpath they had crossed. Bran whistled a 3rd time and called in Welsh. There was concern in his voice. Will said, "Wherever could he have gone? He was right behind me when I came over the wall. He never does this, never. He will never go from me without permission, or not come when he is called." Bran gazed anxiously up and down the footpath. "I don't like it. I shouldn't have let him come so near Mr. Pritchard's land. You and me is one thing, but Kafal." He whistled again, loud and desperate. "You don't suppose," Will said. He stopped. "That Pritchard would shoot him, the way he said?" "No, I was going to say, you don't suppose Kafal wouldn't come because he knew he shouldn't go on Mr. Pritchard's land. But that's silly. No dog could work out something like that." "Oh," Bran said unhappily, "dogs can work out things a lot more complicated than that. I don't know. Let's try this way. It leads to the river." They set off along the path, away from the looming mass of the rock, Craig Aderin. Somewhere ahead of them, a long way off, a dog barked. "Is that him?" Will said hopefully. Bran's white head was cocked on one side. The dog barked again, closer. "No, that's John Rowland's big dog, Pen. But Kafal might have gone that way when he heard him." They both broke into a run, along the stony grass patched path. Will very soon lost his breath and dropped behind. Bran disappeared round a bend in the path ahead of him. When Will turned the corner himself, two things slammed simultaneously into his consciousness: the sight of Bran, without guffaw, talking to his father and John Rowlands, and the sick certainty that something evil had taken control of everything that was happening now on Coolwood Farm. It was a recognition, like the sudden sensing of an overwhelming sound or smell. He came panting up to them, as Bran said. Heard Pen bark and thought he might have come this way, so we came running. And you saw nothing at all? Owen Davies said. His face was tight with some deep concern. Looking at it, Will felt foreboding clutch at the pit of his stomach. John Rowland said, his deep voice strained. And you, Will, did you see anything on the path just now? Will stared. No, only Kafal, before, and now we've lost him. No creature came past you? Nothing at all. Why? What's wrong? Owen Davies said bleakly. In the big pasture up the way there are 4 dead sheep with their throats torn out, and there's no gate open or any sign of what can have attacked them. Will looked in horror at John Rowlands. Is it the same? Who can tell? Said the shepherd bitterly. Like Davies, he seemed caught between distress and rage. But it is not dogs. I do not see how it could be dogs. It looks more like the work of foxes. Though how can that be? I do not know. The Milgwyn from the hills, said Bran. Nonsense, his father said. The what? Said Will. The Milgwyn, Bran said. His eyes were still darting around in search of Kafal, and he spoke automatically. Gray foxes. Some of the farmers say there are big gray foxes that live up in the mountains, bigger and faster than our red foxes down here. Owen Davies said, that is nonsense. There are no such things. I've told you before, I will not have you listening to those rubbishy old tales. His tone was sharp. Bran shrugged. But across the front of Will's mind there came suddenly a brilliant image, clear as a film thrown on a screen. He saw 3 great foxes trotting in line, enormous gray-white animals with thick coats growing to the broadness of a ruff round their necks, and full brush-like tails. They moved across the hillside among rocks, and for an instant one of them turned its head and looked full at him, with bright, unwinking eyes. For that instant he could see them as clearly as he could see Bran. Then the image was gone. They were vanished, and he was standing again in the sunshine, mute, dazed, knowing that in one of the brief communications that can come, very rarely, only very rarely, unguarded from one old one to another, his masters had sent him a warning picture of the creatures of the Grey King, agents of the dark. He said abruptly, they aren't tales. Bran is right. Bran stared at him, shaken by the crisp certainty in his voice, but Owen Davies looked across in chilly reproof. The corners of his thin mouth turned down. Don't be foolish, boy, he said coldly. What can you know of our foxes? Will never knew what he could have said in answer, for breaking into the tense stillness of the sunlit afternoon came a shout from John Rowlands, urgent, loud. Todd, look over there. There is fire on the mountain. Fire! Fire on the mountain. There was not much smoke for so much fire. In a line along the lower slope of the mountain, which they could only just see above the hedge from where they stood, flames were blazing in the bracken. It was like a long wound, a gash in the peaceful brown slope, quivering with deadly, ominous life. Yet there was little color in it, and they were too far away to hear any sound. For a moment Will was conscious only of wonder that John Rowland should have caught sight of it all. Then they were deep in instructions and the urgency of Rowland's soft voice. Off to the farm, both of you, quick. Call the fire from Twin and the police. Then come back with anyone who is there. All the hands you can get. And bring more fire brooms. Bran, you know where they are. Come on, Owen. Both men ran up the path across the valley, and the boys divided for the gate that led over the fields of Coolwood Farm. Bran swung his head round in a whirl of white hair. Take it gently now, he said earnestly, or you'll be worse ill. And he was off like a sprinter, leaving Will to close the gate and trot resignedly in his wake. The telephoning was done by the time he ran up at the farm. David Evans took them with him in the Land Rover, with Riz and a tall, thin farmer called Tom Ellis, who had been there when they arrived. The back of the little car had been hastily filled with fire brooms and sacking, and several buckets that Will's uncle seemed to have small hope of using. The dogs, for once, were left behind. They will be no good with fire, Riz said, seeing Will cock his head to the plaintive barking, and the sheep can get out of the way on their own. Indeed, they will all be well away by now. I wonder where Kafal is, Will said, and then caught sight of Bran's face and wished he had not. Close to, the fire on the mountain was very much more alarming than it had seemed from a distance. They could smell it now and hear it, the smell of smoke more bitter than a farm bonfire, hearing the soft, dreadful sound of flames consuming the bracken like paper crumpled in the hand, and the sudden crackling roar as a bush or patch of gorse went up. And they could see the flames leaping high, bright red and yellow at the edges of the fire, but ferocious and near invisible at its heart. As they tumbled out of the car, David Evans was yelling for the fire brooms. Will and Bran pulled them out. Besoms made like those for old-fashioned sweeping, But with the twigs longer and wider spread, John Rollins and Bran's father, already equipped, were thrashing at the leading edge of the fire, trying to contain it, but the wind was gusting higher, and the flames, now leaping, now creeping, were soon past them and traveling along the lower edge of the mountain. As they swept upwards, roaring up the hillside through the tinder-dry bracken, Owen Davies jumped out of the way only just in time. The crackling rose, the air was full of fumes, and smoke and whirling black specks of charcoal and ash. Great heat shone out at them. They were all in line, beating at the flames, flailing away with all their might, yet only occasionally extinguishing a spark. John Rowland shouted something desperately in Welsh, then seeing Will's uncomprehending face near him, gasped out, "We must drive it higher before it can reach Pritchard's. Keep it from the rock." Peering ahead at the great outsweeping rocky slope of the Craig Erin, Will glimpsed for the first time the corner of gray stone building jutting out beyond its far side. The light glinted on a spray of water flowing up beside the house. Someone was soaking the land all around it, in an effort to deaden the fire if it should reach that far. But Will, beating hopelessly with his long, flat-tipped broom, felt that nothing could halt or check the inferno before them, snarling high over their heads now as it reached a tangle of blackberry bushes. It was like a huge beast raging over the mountain, gobbling up everything in its path with irresistible greed. It was so powerful, and they so small, that even the effort to control its path seemed ludicrous. He thought, "It is like the dark," and for the first time found himself wondering how the fire could have begun. Below them, from the road past the foot of the great crag, came the clanging of a fire engine's bell, and Will glimpsed patches of bright red through the trees, and a hose snaking through the air. Men's voices were calling faintly, and there was a sound of engines. But here on the slope, the fire was gaining a greater hold, as the gusting wind caught it in patches, and gradually they were forced downward, into the trees edging the road. In triumphant thunder, the fire roared after them. "Down the road," the thin man Tom Ellis called. "Those trees will catch in a minute." Will panted along at John Rowland's side. What will happen? Burn itself out eventually. But the Welshman's creased face was grim. Bran came trotting up at his other side with his white skin smudged and dirty. "This wind is the trouble. Taking it up the valley is Pritchard's place. Really in danger, Mr. Rowlands?" John Rowlands checked his stride for a moment to gaze all around the sky. Clouds were forming in the blue air now, strange, ragged, dirty white clouds that seemed to be coming from no one direction. "I don't know. The wind is for a change in the weather, and it is shifting, but hard to tell where. We shall have rain sooner or later." "Well," Will said hopefully, "the rain will put the fire out, won't it?" But as he spoke, he could hear the crackle and roar of the fire like laughter at his back, and he was not surprised when John Rowland shook his head. "Only a great deal of rain. The ground is so dry as it never is this time of year. Nothing but a downpour will have any effect at all." He looked around again, frowning at the mountains and the sky. Something is strange about this fire and everything. Something is wrong. He shook his shoulders, giving up the search, and strode on ahead as they rounded a bend and came towards the fire engine and its thunderous thrumming engine. Will thought, John Rowland, you see more than you think you see, though not quite enough. The Dark Lord has begun his work in these mountains. The great king is building up a wall to enclose the golden harp, and the sleepers who must be awakened, so that I may not come to them and fulfill the quest. For if he can keep them from the reach of the light, then the old ones will not come into their full power, and there will be none to keep the dark from rising. He said without knowing that he spoke aloud, "But it won't work." A voice said softly in his ear, "What won't work?" Bran's dark, smoky spectacles, shrouding the eyes behind, were staring into his face. Will looked at him and said with sudden, naked honesty, "I don't know what to make of you." "I know you don't," Bran said, a quirk of a smile twitching his strange, pale face. "But you're going to need me all the same." He spun round as smoke from the fire up the hillside came billowing down around them. "Don't worry," he said, grinning. "Nobody else has ever known what to make of me either." And he was off, spinning, running, almost dancing up the road towards the fire engine. Will ran after him, and then in a moment both of them were brought up short by a sight more astonishing than anything yet. Beneath the looming bulk of Craig Erin, the firemen had two hoses playing, drenching both the mountain and the side of the road in an effort to check the fire from leaping over the crag and down to Pritchard's farm. Others ran here and there with buckets, fire brooms, anything which stray sparks might be drowned or beaten out before they gained a hold. The road was buzzing with anxious activity. Yet in the midst of it all, standing rigid and oblivious with fury, stood Caradog Pritchard, his red hair bristling, blood on his shirt, and a shotgun leveled in one hand, and the other hand out rigid, pointing in accusation as he screamed with rage at John Rowlands. "Bring me the dog. Bring him. I will prove to you that it was him. Him and that freakish white hound of the freak boy Davies. I will show you 6 sheep in my field. There are 6 of them with their throats ripped out. Demo, there. heads half off, all for black joy, and that is what those bloody dogs had of it, and that is what I shall shoot them for. Bring them here, bring them, and I will prove it to you." The boy stood frozen, gazing at him in horror. He was not for that moment a human being, but a frenzied creature possessed by rage, turned into an animal. All that he could be seen in him was the urge to hurt, and it was, as it always will be, the most dreadful sight in the world. Looking at Pritchard with the eye of a human and the vision of an old one, Will was fulfilled with an overpowering compassion, an awareness of what must inevitably overtake Caradog Pritchard if he were not checked now, for always, in this passion before it was too late. "Stop," he longed to call to him, "stop, before the great king sees you and puts out his hand in friendship, and you, unwitting, take it and are destroyed." Before he thought what he was doing, he stepped forward, and the movement brought the red-haired man swinging towards him. The finger wheeled viciously around, jabbing at him through the air. "You there, too. By Spock, you are part of it. You and your uncle's farm. They are quid dogs, these murdering brutes. It is all on your heads, and I will have my due from all of you. From all of you." Spittle foamed at the corners of his mouth. There was no speaking to him. Will fell back, and with the fury of Pritchard's shouting, even the firefighters paused in amazement. There was no sound but the thump of the fire engines pumping and the crackle of the approaching flames, and no movement for an instant anywhere. Then David Evans pushed forward, a small brisk form with a fire broom in his hand and smudges of soot on his face and shirt, and he took Pritchard fearlessly by the shoulder and shook him hard. "The fire will be on us in minutes. Caradog, Pritchard, do you want your farm to burn? All of us here are working our hands raw to keep the flames from your roof, and your wife inside there doing the same, and you stand here shouting your silly head off and thinking of nothing but a few dead sheep. A lot more dead sheep you will have, man, and a dead farm too, if you do not pull yourself together now. Now." Pritchard gazed blankly at him, the small bright eyes squinting suspiciously in the pudgy face, and then he seemed gradually to wake up and to realize where he was and what was happening. Dazed, he stared at the flames leaping closer beyond the hedge. The pump of the fire engine rose to a high pitch. As the workers swung their hoses round to meet the advancing fire, sparks flew in all directions as the beaters thwacked frantically at the bracken. Caradog Pritchard gave one short squeal of terror, turned, and rushed back towards his farmhouse. Without a word, Will and Bran rejoined the line of beaters, edging diagonally up the hillside in an effort to keep the fire from sweeping over and beyond the crag. The sky was growing darker as the clouds thickened, and the evening drew on, but there was no hint of rain. Again the wind gusted, dropped to nothing, rose in sudden new gust. There was no telling what it would do next. More and more strongly Will could feel the enmity of the great king thrusting at him from high peaks at the head of the valley. It made a wall as fierce as the wall of flames roaring towards them from the other direction. Though the only one who could feel the force of both, the only one caught between the two, was the old one, Will Stanton, bound by birth to follow this quest wherever it might lead. He was swept up suddenly in a wild exhilaration, bringing energy from nowhere to harden his drooping arms and legs. Yelling with sudden glee, grinning madly at Bran, he whacked at the flames, licking the bracken at his feet as if he could flatten them in an instant into the ground. Then a flash of movement higher up the mountain caught his eyes away from the line of flame, and out of the bare rocks above he saw, flinging itself forward at astonishing speed, the form of a gray-white fox, brush flying out behind, ears back. It leapt up the towering side of Craig Aderin. Smoke billowed, rising on the wind, and the fox was gone. Will had seen it for only a quick moment. He heard a high wail from Bran. "The fall!" Then the Welsh boy was scrambled up the slope, ignoring cries of concern from below, ignoring the fire and the smoke and all else except the glimpse of the white animal he had thought was his dog. "Bran, come back! It isn't Kafal." Will climbed desperately after him, his heart thumping as if it would leap out of his chest. "Bran, come back!" Steeper and steeper the slope grew, until they were upon the crag itself, scrambling through bracken, over slippery grass, round jutting shelves of gray rock. Bran pushed at last on one of these, panting, staring wildly about him. Will stumbled up beside him, hardly able to speak. "Kafal!" Bran shouted into nowhere. "It wasn't Kafal, Bran." "Of course it was him. It was. I saw him. It was a fox, Bran. One of the Milgwen. Bran, it's a trick, don't you see?" Will coughed, choking and billowly. Gust of smoke from the black cloud that wreathed round the slope beneath and below them. They could see nothing but smoke and the steepy rock, with patches of gray sky above their heads. Below there was no sign of the farm or men or the valley, and in their ears no sound but the sighing of the wind and somewhere the harsh, faint voices of birds. Bran looked at Will uncertainly. "Bran, I'm sure of it." "All right. I was so certain. I'm sorry." "Don't be. It wasn't you seeing. It was the great king making you see. But the trouble is we can't go back that way. The fire's coming up after us. There is a way down the other side, Bran said, brushing sweat from his eyes. No bracken for the fire to burn there, just rock, but it's hard going. He looked doubtfully at Will's pale, smudged face. I'm all right. Go on, go on. They clambered up through the rough stairway of grass and rock, holding on now with both hands and feet. There's a bird nest here. Will had glimpsed an untidy pile of twigs and bracken a foot from his head. There'd be birds, too, if it weren't for the fire. It's a nesting place in spring, I told you. Not just the cormorants, ravens, too. Lots of birds, which is why they call it Bird Rock, of course. Here. Bran paused upright on a broad shelf of rock, edged with bracken. This is the ridge. It goes down the other side towards Pritchard Farm. But Will was standing very still, looking at him. Bird Rock? That's right, Bran said, surprised. Bird Rock. Craig Adrian. Rock of the Birds. I thought you knew that, Will said softly, reflectively. On the day of the dead, when the year too dies, must the youngest open the oldest hills, through the door of the birds, where the breeze breaks. Bran stared at him. You mean the door of the birds here? Bird Rock. It must be. I know it. And this is the day of the dead. Will swung his head sharply, gazing up at the sky where the clouds flew like great puffs of smoke. And the wind's changing. Feel. No? Yes, there again. A bad wind. A wind from the dark. I don't like it, Bran. It has the Great King in it. He spoke now with no thought of Bran as anything but an ally, ever. The white-haired boy said bleakly, It's swinging to the north. That is the worst wind of all, the north wind. Gwynd Trade Year Mir, they call it. The wind that blows round the feet of the dead. It brings storms, and worse, sometimes. The distant crackling of the fire seemed louder now. Will glanced over his shoulder down the hill. The smoke was thicker there, and he felt more heat in the air. The wind whirled in gusts, catching up cinders and soot from below into strange dark eddies round their heads. All at once Will knew with dreadful certainty that the Great King was aware of him, precisely aware, gathering his power for attack, and that it was at that first moment of awareness that the fire on the mountain had begun. He flinched in a sudden sense of fearful loneliness. An old one, alone without others of the light, was vulnerable to the dark at its strongest. Though he could not be destroyed for all time, yet he could be disarmed. The full power of a Lord of the Dark could, if it struck him defenseless, blast him out of time for so great a space that he could be of no help to his fellows until too late. So the Great King struck now at will with fire, and with all else that might be at his command. And Bran was more vulnerable yet. Will swung back quickly. Bran, come on, along the edge, to the top, before the fire. His voice died in his throat, silently on the ridge around them, out of holes and crevices, round corners and crags, came slinking the gray-white, ghostly shapes of the milkmen, more than a score of them, heads held low, teeth grinning, a white tip glimmering on each stiffly held, gray bushy tail. Their foxy smell was in the air, stronger than the smoke. At their head stood the king fox, their leader, red tongue glowing from the mouth set in a wide, dreadful grin, its white teeth long as fingers and sharp as nails, icicles of bone. The eyes were bright, the ruff stood out white round the huge shoulders and neck. Will clenched his fist, shouting angry words of power in the old speech, but the gray fox did not flinch. Instead, it made a sudden sharp leap into the air, straight up the one spot, as Will had seen a fox do in a Buckinghamshire field far away from this valley, to discover what danger lurked in a field of wheat higher than its head. As it jumped, the kind fox gave one short, sharp bark, deep and clear. The milkman snarled below, and an abrupt woof of flame shot up at Will's side with the sound of his tearing cloth, as the fire of the mountain burst at last on the ridge of Craig Adrian, roared, cackling round them in the bracken. Will shrank back. There was no way of escape but past the king fox, and the big fox crouched motionless, low on its belly, tensing itself to spring. There was a sudden piercing yell at Will's shoulder. Bran leapt forward, waving in his hand a crooked branch of scrub oak blazing like tinder, a sheaf of flame. He thrust it full into the gray fox's face. Screaming, the animal fell back amongst its fellows in the fox's melting confusion. Before the branch could burn down to his arm, Bran flung it aside. But unexpectedly, caught by a gust of wind, it fell over the opposite side of the ridge, down toward the unburned slope. Out it went, and over the edge, and down to the far side of the crag, where the fire might not have otherwise have gone. There was a gasp of flame as the fire took hold on its new prey. Bran wailed in horror. Will, I've been and sent the fire down to Pritchard's farm. We're cut off both ways. The top, Will called urgently. We must get to the top. With all the certainty of ancient instincts, he knew the place they must find. It had begun compelling to call. to him, unseen, waking to his quest. He knew that what it would look like. He knew what he must do when they reached it. But the reaching was another matter. Flames crackled at either side of them, crouching their skin dry. Ahead, the Milgwen gathered now in a tight semicircle, waiting. Desperately, Will put protection about himself and Bran, standing foursquare, facing the north and calling some words in the old speech. It was the spell of Helid, to give freedom to wander against any compulsion by those the land over which he roamed. But there was not much hope in mind. He knew it could not hold for very long. Beside him, he heard Bran give a great, flooring shout, like an animal child calling for help without knowing that he calls. Kafal, Kafal! And out of nowhere, along the ridge towards them, came a white streak, leaping at the nearest fox, charging it sideways so that it spun round with a shriek rolling over and over. The tight semicircle wavered, uncertain. Kafal leapt, snarling at the next fox, his jaws closing quick and hard on its shoulder, and the animal squealed dreadfully and twisted away. There in the rent he had torn in the rank of Milgwen, the white dog stood, belligerent as a bull, with his legs planted firm on the rock, and the message glinting in his strange silvery eyes was clear. Will grabbed Bran by the arm and slipped out with him past Kafal, free, while the panting foxes hesitated. Up here, Bran, quick, it's the only place. Bran's eyes flickered over earth and white fur, dark hills and gray sky. He saw the great king fox of the Milgwen watching them controlled again, poised for pursuit. Then Kafal, curving to face the animal, began a long crescendo snarl, more blood-curdling than any sound Bran had ever heard in his life. In fulfillment of some long destiny, the dog was making it possible for them to escape. There was no excuse not to obey. With a sudden flooding of thrust and hummed humility, Bran turned and scrambled upwards after Will. Clambering on hands and feet over the rocky ridge, Will made for the place to which they must go. It sang to him, beckoning. Below the rocks to which they clung, smoke swirled like a dark sea. High above, unseen birds screamed and cawed in angry fear. When he could climb no further, Will saw a narrow overhung cleft in the rocks before him. A long slit had broadened and eroded by frost and wind and rain. Its gray granite sides were green-patched with lichen. Irresistibly, it summoned him. He called to Bran, in here. Then his voice rose louder, commanding, Kafal. The granite sides of the cleft towered 3 times higher than his head. Entering, Will glanced back over his shoulder and he saw Bran following, bemused, and then a quick white shape slipping after him, as Kafal darted forward, nuzzling his nose briefly into Bran's hand as he passed. Outside on the rock, a shrieking tumult of baffled rage rose from the furious Milgwen, prevented from entry. Their master's power, Will now knew, was the power over the rock and the mountains and all the high places of Gwynedd, but only over those. Inside the rock and the mountain was a different domain. He went on. At its far end, the rocky cleft widened a little. The light was dim. Things seemed distant, as if in a dream. Outside, the foxes barked and screamed, and then there was nothing more ahead of Will but barely gray rock, a formidable blank wall ending the cleft. Will stared at the rock, and his mind filled with a warmth of discovery and relief as intense as joy. The dog Kafal was at his side and standing straight and proud as a young horse. Will dropped one hand to rest on the white head. The other arm he raised before him with fingers stiff outstretched in a gesture of command, and he called out 3 words in the old speech. And before him the rock parted with a great gate to a faint, very faint sound of delicate music that was achingly familiar and yet strange, gone as the wind, or gone as soon as it was heard. Will walked forward through the rocky doors, with Kafal trotting confidently beside him, head high and tail waving, and Bran, a little hesitantly, followed them.